All right, everyone, let's make some noise and then be quiet for our speaker, Leif.
I'm Leif. I'm currently taking some time off in between jobs, but most recently I was a senior engineering manager at Twilio Segment for the security features team. Currently the co-host of the hit podcast, 404 Security Not Found, which has been described as friends at a conference talking about security stuff. I'm not sure if that was a dig or a compliment. I took it as a compliment. But if that sounds like something you want to use to catch up on some news, we do one a month. And I'm also a startup advisor and investor. So if you have a early stage startup, I'd love to hear about what you're working on. You might be asking what's next. I'm joining SEMGREP in about a month. So if you use SEMGREP and want to give me some feedback on the product, happy to take that. If you don't use it, go buy some SEMGREP, make my options worth something. So the agenda for today, I'm going to give a little bit of context about what our team's up to. I think that's helpful just so that you know the types of things we're creating metrics about. I'm going to try to sell you on why you should be doing metrics at your company, although based on your attendance, I'm going to hope that you're at least kind of bought into that already. Going to kind of walk through a project that we did to really upgrade our own use of metrics, and then wrap things up and maybe have time for questions, although when I was running through the presentation, it was right about time, so you might have to harass me in person afterwards. So most of what our team builds is stuff in the authentication realm, so the whole login, log out flow is all stuff that we work on. We also work on an internal application called Access Service, which is something that you can use to get time-based, peer-reviewed access to things. There's some commercial tools out there that do this now if you're familiar with Okta IGA, Crosswire, or Opal. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that Segment is a business that sells to other businesses, which I think makes security a lot easier. If your customers get mad when you do a bad job at something, the business tends to try to do a good job at that thing. And so I think that investing in this stuff is a little bit easier when you work at a B2B company. So yeah, based on your attendance, I'm going to assume that you're at least kind of bought into metrics, but I think that these are really important because a lot of security teams really struggle to quantify and demonstrate the value that they bring to their org. And I think a lot of that boils down to other parts of the business not knowing enough about your team, which you can fix through internal sales to an extent. And then also security just not understanding enough about the folks that they're supposed to be working with. I think that everybody here has probably heard about a security team that's not giving practical recommendations or stuff that engineers just know won't work. And you really want to minimize that because anytime you do that, people are less likely to work with you in the future. So the right metrics empower teams to communicate cross-functionally. It helps educate other departments about how things are going, what things are important, what things aren't important. And even if you're not a customer-facing team the way that we are, or like a directly customer-facing team, I'd encourage you to get creative about how you can tie things to customer value. I think one thing that I thought was very clever that our GRC team did is they started making our sales team enter in the contract value before they'd give them a SOC 2 report. And this wasn't meant to be like a hurdle or anything. I don't know that there's really a minimum bar, but it's just at the end of the quarter, you can say, hey, we helped out with X million dollars worth of deals because they wanted this SOC 2 report that we had. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Access Service. Again, this is an internal app that we built a couple of years ago. And I think that metrics can also help you justify spending time on internal stuff or help you rationalize to other teams why it isn't a good use of time right now. Without metrics, you might make a statement like this at the end of the quarter or the end of the month or whatever, however long you spend on this, like, hey, this thing felt slow, we sped it up, and now it's fast. But if you have metrics on how slow something actually is, you can make this a lot more impactful by doing a little bit of research, saying, okay, hey, the web standards recommend a page load in 1 second before people start feeling slowed down. It's an internal app, so maybe 2 to 3 seconds is okay, but 5 is definitely too long. And then you can do a calculation. I use calculation very loosely, but really what I'm what you're doing is trying to figure out like the effort to value. And so if you think, hey, it's going to take us 2 weeks to speed this thing up, and we can get a 50% reduction in loading times, like maybe that's good, maybe it's not. But you at least have something that you can go back to other teams internally and say, hey, this is how long it's going to take us to do this thing. This is a good use or a bad use of our time right now. So creating a solid metrics program is pretty time consuming. This was a pretty solid investment in our team, or by our team this past year. It was something that 2 engineers spent like close to a quarter working on. Obviously engineers work on plenty of other things. It's not just 3 months of straight work on something, but this is a pretty big investment. And like any meaningful size project, you should be asking, is this the right thing to do right now? Your company or your team probably has no shortage of good ideas, and it's really about figuring out if it makes sense. But this was something we said we wanted to do at the beginning of the year, so we had already kind of like put some time allocated for it. But we ran into a few issues that I think we probably could have avoided if we had done this work a little bit earlier. We had an internal app that crashed during a big migration, and there wasn't really any warning. We just looked at the logs afterwards and we're like, oh, it hit 100% utilization and crashed. Maybe a warning at like 80 that something bad was going to happen would have been helpful. So I break things down into 2 different groups of metrics: health metrics and product metrics. Health metrics are things that help you answer, is what we maintain dependable, and will we know when something goes wrong? I think security engineering teams should really try to be as similar to their eng counterparts as possible. And so you should just don't reinvent this wheel. Like, just go to your eng team and figure out what they're doing. They're probably better at running reliable services than you anyway. Just steal their homework. And so some things that I think like broadly fit into this category, and like there's probably others too, is air handling. This is pretty self-explanatory, I think, but just to give you some context on like what we actually fixed. We had some things that would send errors to Sentry, but then those were inconsistently sent to Slack. We had some services that would just send stuff to Slack without going through Sentry, and then you lose out on all the benefits of Sentry. We also had stuff going to a bunch of different channels, which is annoying because then people have like more things to look at. It's nice to just say, hey, if it's important, it just goes to this one channel. Sentry also has scheduled task monitoring, so we have a lot of jobs that just run like once or twice a day, and you're just going to assume that those are going to keep working until they don't. And so Sentry's great because they have the ability to tell you like, hey, this thing didn't run, because a lot of times if this stuff doesn't run and it doesn't even start to run, you won't get any errors, so you won't know that it didn't run. We used to use Datadog for this, but we actually found Sentry to be more reliable for monitoring when our stuff was unreliable. SLIs, this is like a really broad category, but you can think of like latency to an external service as something that might fall into SLIs. Application performance monitoring, this is something that allowed us to figure out like what was actually happening in access service, like why it was so slow. These slides are on Sketch, so feel free to keep taking pictures, but they're also up there if you want to just use the stuff that's up there. Service best practices, these aren't really metrics at all. This is just kind of like in the same broad theme. This is having READMEs that are easy to get someone up and running. It's links to dashboards. It's claiming the service in Backstage, which is what we use to track like who owns what. I think of this as just the things that you do to be a good citizen in your organization. So some examples of what we might track for something like offboard service. Offboard service is a pretty simple service. It runs once a day. It boots everyone out of the segment application once they've been deactivated in Okta, and it prevents ex-employees from accessing their accounts. So for the health metrics, does Sentry think this thing ran? Were there any errors? If so, what were they? How long did it take to run? How many calls did it make to the Okta API? And is this service something that, if somebody needed to make some changes, they're not going to get bogged down in like fixing a bunch of unrelated nonsense and just like have a really hard time getting the service up and running. Switching over to product metrics, I think this is the fun part. You get to put on your product manager hat and think about why the stuff that you're building is valuable. I think there's also a lot more art on the product metric side than the health metric side. Those are much more science. It's is your thing working or not? But I think everything that your team builds should have at least one product metric. If you can't come up with one reason why the thing that you're building is important, it's probably not a good thing to build. And if you've already built it, you should maybe retire it. I learned a lot about this from a former product manager, Rachel, who I gave a presentation with last year. I would say this presentation is like complimentary. It's not a rehash of last time, but if you want to check this one out, this one's on YouTube on the B-Sides page. Yeah, it's actually the same brand, and I have matching shorts for both of these, but I didn't know if people wanted that, so I wore pants. All right, I'm keeping that. Next time I'll wear the matching tops and bottoms. So product metrics. Without any metrics, you could probably say something like this at the end of the, however long it takes you to build this. We built offboard service. It removed X employees. Simple. But if you throw even like a little bit of data in it, it sounds a lot better. And so you can say, hey, not only does this help retain customer trust, it helps maintain our compliance with our internal policies. It helps with our SOC 2. And in the first 30 days, it offboarded 60 ex-employees, 48 of which were missed by previous manual reviews. So you can draw some comparisons to the before state once you have this kind of information. For product metrics, there's plenty of other things that could be a product metric. These are just some things that I think are worth at least considering. If you can tie something to customer revenue, that's always a good one. If that's a little bit more difficult, just having some data on like how many customers are using this, either just raw numbers or percentage. For internal tools, it's good to try to capture how many people are actually using something in a given week, or how many times a tool completes something. That could be a bad thing avoided or a good thing encouraged. You can also always try to tie things to team goals or org goals or company goals. Those are good because I would say generally those are things that other people should at least be kind of familiar with. And so if you can say, hey, we did this thing that supports this other thing that the company said is important, that is kind of your job. So that's a good thing to try to do for your metrics as well. Some product metrics from SSO. Let's just say you work at a company that has 100 mil in ARR. You might be able to track that 30% of your customers have SSO enabled. And you might find it somewhat surprising that so much more revenue is tied to something rather than the percentage of users. But for something like SSO, that actually makes a lot of sense because your bigger customers are the ones that are more likely to pay the SSO tax. And so they are naturally going to shift this. And then it gets even more, the comparison grows when you talk about something like SCIM, because typically you have to have SSO enabled anyway. If you haven't heard of SCIM and you work at a B2B company, please convince somebody to build it. It makes CorpSec and IT's jobs a lot easier. It basically allows you to do provisioning and deprovisioning and group mapping and a bunch of stuff. So getting started, hopefully you have a list of what your team owns. If not, that's okay, but that's definitely step 0, is figure out what you want to start tracking things about. And then figure out what the current state of these are. Like maybe you have some metrics, maybe you don't, that's fine too. And then you should have some idea of where you're trying to go. You're obviously gonna figure stuff out along the way, which is great. But just have some path that you can plot from A to B. This is an oversimplified version of something that we made pretty early. It's just a list of what we own and then like what the state things are in. More tiles in Datadog or whatever you're using isn't always better. I would say that it can be overwhelming when you have a bunch of useless data. And so more or less is more here. I think that you want to have the right stuff tracked rather than just like a bunch of stuff. So for our implementation, we have all of our services send stuff to Sentry or Datadog, and then we send stuff to Slack. We also have an internal logging system that is used just kind of like for debugging stuff. So that's kind of unrelated to this, but also part of the same project. On the metrics side, we're very fortunate to work at a company that has very smart data engineers and analytics folks that have set up a bunch of this foundation for us. And so we didn't have to figure out how to tie something to a customer account in Salesforce and get the ARR. Like there was already patterns in place where we could say, hey, this workspace is related to this amount of money. But I think that getting good with business intelligence software is pretty valuable for engineers, whether that's a security engineer, a software engineer, or whatever, because it allows you to answer a lot of interesting questions about your business. You can also use BI tools to augment internal product functionality. So we do this for access service, which, as I mentioned earlier, it's something where you can say, hey, I need access to this thing for a certain amount of time, like a day or a week. Somebody else approves you, and then you get access, and then it expires. But we often get asked questions that we don't want to build something in the product to answer this question. We can just refer somebody to a dashboard. So somebody might ask, like, what are all the tiles that this person is an approver for? They're going on parental leave, and we want to make sure that we have coverage for them. And, you know, if we were a commercial product, we would have to write some database queries, add some new routes, put some stuff in the UI, write tests, but you can just skip all that and just write some queries and create a dashboard in Snowflake, and you know it's fine if you make an internal person go somewhere else. So some product metrics that you might, or that we thought about for access service, just to give some more examples of what an internal app like this might care about. Tiles with less than 3 approvers. So if this is an Okta app or a group that only has 1 approver and that person leaves, that can be annoying to people that need access to that thing. More generally, if you have an internal tool, trying to figure out how many people are using this. If someone's like, hey, why are we spending so much time on this? And you can say, hey, 1/3 of our company uses this every week. That's a lot easier to justify spending time on that. Something like median approval time allows us to do a contrast between the before and after. It used to take hours or maybe a day to get access to something. With access service, it's maybe like 3 or 4 minutes in most cases. And then the most active users are a great pool of people to get feedback from. So if you want to build something new or you want to change something, like hit those people up because they're the people that probably care the most about what your app does. So let's assume you love these ideas, you want to do this at your own company. You should take stock of like where your metrics are at before. Maybe these are all zeros, which is totally fine. That's going to make you look really good at the end of the project. But you should have some metrics about your metrics. So you can say, hey, you know, just like any other project, this was a lot of work. We spent a lot of time on it. You know, this is kind of the before and after. And this does get like a little bit meta of like, hey, we put metrics on your metrics, but this is just you can just think of this as a project. And your projects probably want to have metrics. This one just happens to also be about metrics. Pause for photos. So once you do this, you should share your work. There's probably a lot of other teams that want something like this at your company. And some of the things that we did to make this easier, every single snow site dashboard, Sal can attest to this, he built a lot of them, has comments. And so anybody else from security or wherever, they can go in and they can see, oh, this is why they did that crazy join that I don't understand. Let me just copy that because I want the same thing. You should have links to all this stuff in your READMEs, make it easy for people to find this stuff, and then present it internally. Nobody's going to know that you did this stuff if you don't tell them that you did it. And this is a good way to practice a lot of things, but it's also a good way just to make people aware of what's available to them and say like, hey, go steal our queries. They're also a great thing to put in promo packets. I think that a lot of managers get caught off guard when people start asking them questions about impact and stuff like that. And it's a lot easier if you can just say like, hey, we made this thing 25% better or 25% faster or whatever, if you have the data. At least that's been my experience during promo and like calibration time is I feel like the managers that have metrics usually do better. This is also something that you should start thinking about during project planning. So we actually have a section in our template that's like, what are you going to track about this thing? And you don't even necessarily have to have a goal. Like you don't have to say like, hey, we're going to make this thing 10% better or whatever. I think it's good if you do. But just having the raw data so that at some point in the future when you want to make improvements, you don't have to spend a month collecting data. You just have the data about like the usage and things like that. You need to include time for this in your project plan. If you don't, somebody's just going to say, hey, the thing's built move on to the next thing. Unfortunately, this stuff has to happen at the end because otherwise there's no data to build the dashboards. And so it can be put into an awkward spot, but I think if you put this as part of your project plan, it makes it easier to defend the time that it takes to do this. One last example, this was something that we had an intern 2 summers ago. She did a fantastic job on this project. The goal was to get more people using MFA, more customers specifically using MFA. And the way that we targeted them is we went after the workspace owners and got the workspace owners to force MFA for their workspace, because then that just gets everybody. And without any metrics, this still would have been pretty good, especially for an intern, like, hey, successfully completed this project, got a lot of people to enroll. But because we had metrics of how many people were using MFA before, we could do something like this where it's like, hey, we actually saw a 25% increase. These are the total number of impacted users for all those workspaces. We had originally guessed we'd maybe see like a 10% increase. So I don't know if we were just bad at guessing or just sandbagging, but yeah, this looked really good during her final presentation. Some closing thoughts. Metrics make your team stand out during quarterly progress reports and help you supercharge performance reviews. And they also make it easy to communicate cross-functionally. And it allows your organization to see how things are getting hopefully better, maybe worse over time, but just having the data makes that a lot easier. So if you want to try this for yourself, I highly recommend using whatever your company already has set up and is paying for. This stuff does mention like Segment and Snowflake and whatever, but all of those are things that could be swapped out for like Tableau or like whatever else you're using. This will be recorded as part of B-Sides. I wrote a blog about this in December, so if you want to go back and not listen to me again and just read through it, pretty much everything in here is in there. And if you don't have this stuff set up and you want to play around with stuff on your own, Twilio or Segment and Snowflake both have free tutorials, so you can mess around with stuff. But yeah, definitely use what your company's paying for. And then lastly, we got some other talks to watch. My girlfriend's on a panel with some other great people some of them are in the front row. I don't see Louie, but wow. There's some okay people on the panel. And then tomorrow we have some current and past Twilio folks. So we've got Kelly Robinson. We've got Sal, who I mentioned earlier. He's talking about some cool API security stuff we're doing. And then Colleen, right there, our former CISO, is on a panel as well. So check these out. The slides are already up, as I mentioned, and then the blog's there. Questions, or do I get kicked off? 1 minute? All right, let's do it. Yeah. The audience is counting on you.
Yeah, if we have one question, we have 1 minute to stop. So if somebody has a hot take for Leif, raise your hands and sing it out loud.
What about incident response metrics specifically? You guys incorporate any of that?
Are you talking about that tomorrow or later today? Or no? So my team doesn't really do incident response stuff unless it's helping out with something that we own. I imagine that there's probably a place for metrics on any security team, but I'm not a good person to ask about that.
Come to our panel.
Yeah, go to the panel. They claim they'll talk about it. Hey.
So I have all of this incredibly awesome stuff in Snowflake, and I know it's really useful. But I'm not very bright. What's the best way to sort of visualize it and make it work?
So Snowsight is the BI tool that either Snowflake comes with or we pay extra for. And it can help you create like graphs and charts, and like it's basically like all the stuff that maybe you used in PowerPoint at some point growing up based off of the Excel data. So once you have the data in there, it's pretty easy. And if your company has, data engineering or analytics, just make them help you until you get good.
What's your favorite?
All right, folks, that's been great. Leif will be out in the hall.